Chapter 6: Concepts and Definitions. So let's talk about the basic structure of the camera, whether it's in a DSLR or it's in your smartphone. Some of the components of the camera are the lens, aperture, shutter, and image sensor. So what is the purpose of lens? The lens gathers the light from the source, and before actually it goes on the image sensor, it passes through the aperture and shutter. So what is aperture? Aperture is used to control the amount of light passing through this. This is, imagine as if you are opening and closing a tap. The amount of water you want in the tap, you set your tap accordingly. Shutter is basically opening and closing of the windows in order to control the light falling on the image. In the next section, we will see how the choice of lens, aperture, shutter, and image sensor all play a role in order to achieve the best cinematic look we are looking for. So what's inside a camera? Essentially, it consists of lens, aperture, shutter, and image sensor. What does the lens do? Lens gathers light from the source, which we call the subject. Power of lens is measured in focal length. So measured in millimeters is the distance between the lens and its image. Let's try to illustrate the concept of focal length. We have the lens and we have the light coming from the left hand side, and we are seeing the image is getting focused on the right hand side. So this distance from the center of the lens to the focus is called the focal distance. So let's talk about types of lenses. We have three categories of lenses. The first is the standard lens, which is typically a 50 mm lens. 50 mm typically mimics a human eye. So it is used in applications like portraits, street photography, or in travel applications. Another category of lens is the wide lens. As the name suggests, it covers a wide area, typically landscapes. Wide lens are less than 50 mm lenses. Focal length used for wide lens is 16 mm, for 24 mm, etc. Third category of lenses is the telescopic lens, which is greater than 50 mm. As the name suggests, it acts like a telescope. That means for viewing far objects. Typically 100 mm, 200 mm, 300 mm lenses are telescopic lenses used for sports and wildlife applications. We have three lenses on iPhone 12 Pro Max. The first is the ultra wide lens, which is designated by 0.5x, wide lens with 1x, telescopic lens with 2.5x. Depending on what you want to capture on your screen, you can select the lens accordingly. And also remember, you can adjust the screen for a desired frame. And for your phone, you need to check your specification of the lens is available. So if we select the 0.5x, you will get a ultra wide view, which will cover a huge area. In order to narrow down our view, we go to 1x. In order to further narrow down our view on the frame, we select 2.5x. Aperture. So what is aperture? Aperture are blades on your lenses. The purpose of aperture is to control the amount of light, which we also call the exposure, and also aperture controls the depth of field. And as you see, as the aperture goes smaller and smaller, your light becomes less. Now in order to illustrate the concept of aperture, let's say on the left hand side we have covered the whole of the lens with aperture, and obviously when we cover whole of the lens, we'll get no light. Now let's move on to the next lens. We have little opening, so we get little light. So on again, if we try to increase the opening, we'll get more light, and if we keep on increasing and keep on increasing, we'll get eventually the most light. So we can see clearly aperture is used to control the amount of light entering the lens. and ultimately it controls the exposure. Now the question is, how do we measure the aperture, or in other words, how do we measure the opening of the blades? We use a term called f-stop scale. So let's try to avoid too much of technical details with the f-stop number. You should remember in this fashion: lower the f-stop number, for instance it is written in 1.4 or f-stroke 1.4, implies the widest possible opening of the lens. Highest number like f16 or f-stroke 16 implies narrowest possible opening of the lens. As you can see, on the left hand side we have the widest possible opening, and on the right hand side we have the narrowest possible opening, and we have in between the intermediate opening. As per the f-stop scale, the lowest number is assigned to the widest opening. Inversely, on the narrow scale, the f-stop numbers increases. So typically 1.4 is for the widest possible opening, f16 or sometimes even f22 is on the narrowest possible opening. So intermediate would be like f5.6, f11 and so on. So let's talk about the depth of field. Depth of field is the zone in your photo that appears in focus. For shallow, depth of field would imply that near object is in focus and the background to be blurry. So how do we get a shallow depth of field? We simply use a wide aperture. Wider the aperture, more shallow is the depth of field. In terms of f-stop numbers, you can use a lower f-stop number in order to get shallow depth of field. Now let's try to visualize how the aperture affects the depth of field. As we can see, we have the widest possible aperture, 1.4, we get a shallow depth of field. If we go up to f16, we will get a deep depth of field. For an intermediate depth of field, we would need aperture like f5.6. In the illustration, we are using a focus app. As you can see the aperture scale, in order to get a shallow depth of field, we lower the aperture value to 1.4, and we see the near object is in focus and the background is blurry. As we increase the aperture up to 16, we see the far object becomes visible. We have a deep depth of field. What does the shutter do? Shutter controls the amount of light. This comes as no-brainer, which controls the exposure ultimately. It also controls the motion blur in the video. What does an image sensor do? Image sensor converts incident light, which are photons, into image. Sensitivity of the image sensor is measured in ISO. Also controls the exposure, just like your aperture and shutter. ISO is displayed in numbers like 50, 100, 200 and 400 on your phone or even the camera. Think ISO is like an internal knob to control the light. Low ISO is used for outdoor applications like 50 or 100. Higher ISO are used in dark conditions like 200, 400 and so on. Also be mindful, too much ISO can introduce some grain in the picture. So in case you are wondering what ISO stands for, ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. It's an organization that sets international standards for all different kind of measurements. Photography and videography are no different. Let's go through some fundamental concepts in cinema. So what is photography? Photography consists of two words: photo, which means light, graphy means drawing. So we can say photography is the art of drawing with light. So what is a video? Video is also known as motion picture. As the name suggests, it's motion of pictures. So basically we have photographs run in succession to give an illusion of smooth continuous motion. Cinematic comes from the word cinema, which means movie-like look. So how do we get a movie-like look? The answer is simple: through cinematography. What is cinematography? Cinematography is an art and science of visual storytelling in a motion picture. Cinematography is mocha of the mocha we discussed earlier. It comprises of all on-screen visual elements: lighting, framing, composition, camera motion, camera angles, film selection, lens choices, depth of field, zoom, focus, color, exposure, and filtration. We will deal all these in the coming chapters. So what does a cinematographer do? A cinematographer is also known as director of photography. He or she is in charge of the camera and the lighting crew. They are responsible for creating a look, color, lighting, and for framing every shot in the film. The film director and cinematographer work closely with one another. The main job of cinematographer is to ensure that his choices support the director's overall vision of the movie. In your case, you are the cinematographer as well as the director. Congratulations.